I'm Dr. Dina Dye with Foundations in Torah. Welcome to this session. We're going to look at the Torah portion Noach, but we're going to look at it from the Brit Hadashah, in particular Matthew 24:36 through 46. Now, there are a number of different outlets that will point us in different directions in the Brit Hadashah or the New Testament, but I've chosen to pick that particular passage. Matthew 24, the key in all of that is the context of that particular chapter. And when it starts out, we see that Yeshua and his Talmudim, or his students, have left the temple grounds and they are on what we would call the Rosh. That would be a place where there was an altar for the burning of the red heifer. So that's where they're sitting, and they're able to look down across the Kidron Valley into the temple, through its gates towards the west, towards the Holy of Holies. Obviously, they can't see into the Holy of Holies, but they are from the east, looking west. And so, as the discussion goes on, Yeshua, as he's looking down, is telling them that not one stone will be left on top of another. So we have to consider what he's saying here, and we have to be able to look at the rest of the chapter in that context. The key here is about the destruction of the temple, which he is prophesying, which of course will happen in 70 Common Era under the Romans. So the Talmudim, the students, are asking, when will these things happen? What is the sign of your coming? And when is the end of the age? Which is a very interesting question, because in the ancient mind, there were two ages. There was the age in which they lived in, which was called the Olam Hazeh, and the world to come, the world outside of the dimension of time, the Olam Haba. Now, when Yeshua brought his kingdom matches with the Olam Haba. It is the world outside of time. So they're asking when the end of the age would conclude. So this is really a prophecy about the destruction of the temple. But we know in John chapter 2, Yeshua says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will rebuild it, and he was speaking of his body. We have a lot of overlapping concepts here. We have to be careful not to replace one with another. Certainly we have the physical temple, certainly we have the body of Messiah, but we also have the greater body, the congregation of the people, as well as his actual body. So both are going on at the same time. Now we know this pattern follows what we have of the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians in 586-87 BCE. So there's a reference in there to that as well. Yeshua points out that they should take their lesson here from the parable of the fig tree. Now, I have a whole teaching on the fig tree. Clearly, I don't have time to go into all of that. But the key in all of this is, for instance, according to Rashi, he said that the fig tree was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Likely the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, if we were looking at it as a symbol in the temple, represented the Ark of the Covenant, while the tree of life represented the menorah. But to just cut to the chase here, trees in Scripture generally represent people, but in particular they represented kings or leaders. And so the fig tree was actually a picture of the kings of Judah, if you will. So it's speaking of leadership. That's the point that's being made here. So the king of the kingdom, and pointing again to the world beyond time. Yeshua talks about the branch becoming tender and putting forth leaves, which is pointing us to the springtime. That's the period of time in which the leaves grow so large on a fig tree that you can't even see the fruit. The fruit is, of course, green. The leaves are large green leaves, and the fruit is hidden. And he tells us that summer is near, and this is actually a play on words here. For the Hebrew word kaitz is summer, but the end is near. It's ketz. They come out of basically the same word. You might recognize miketz, which is one of the Torah portions that speaks of at the end. So he is making a statement about the kingdom coming. It's near. And as they're looking at the temple, they're at the door, etc., etc. I also want to point out that in the book of Jeremiah, it talks about the eating of good figs and bad figs. And in that context, you'll also read about the good figs being its leadership, good leadership, the bad figs being bad leadership. Now, this is critical because as we look at the temple at this particular time in history, it's not functioning very well. And in fact, the leadership has been given over, in particular the high priest, I should say, given over to corruption in all measure of corruption. Graft, extortion, bribery is the order of the day. And so the leadership has led the people astray. In fact, the high priesthood at that time was not the legitimate high priest. It's supposed to come from the line of Aaron, but it's already come down through the Hasmoneans and into the dynasty of Herod. So the temple has become a very contaminated and corrupt place. The high priests in particular are taking advantage of the people, abusing them in all kinds of ways, charging them interest on debt, seizing the tithes at the threshing floor so the people starve. It's a time where they are the elites of the system, and they're taking care of one another. Sounds awfully familiar. They're basically in bed with Rome, and they've sold out the people and the institution for money and for power. So power and influence is how they govern, and God is going to judge the structure because of it, and that not one stone would be left unturned. And there's a lot of temple imagery in this particular passage. Let me just mention since we're tying it to Noah, it was the same in his day, if you will. And so we see this picture of a flood covering the earth. Typically in the ancient Near East, vernacular, floods have to do with enemies running roughshod over the people, destroying. It's a period of instability and chaos. So floods always represented that, chaos and disorder. Temples, when they were built, represented stability. And of course, the enemies were defeating, in particular the Babylonians and the Romans were defeating the people. Ultimately, this is creating a situation in which the temple, again, has been destroyed and the people have been scattered. And when rest comes, as we have this picture in Noach, the Torah portion, that meant that a temple was built, the king was enthroned, he sat on the throne, and this is all enthronement language. So, again, tucked away in this passage, in only just a few verses, we see, as it was in the days of Noah, they were eating and drinking, and they were marrying and being given in marriage, and it all seems very strange to insert all that in that particular passage. But remember, this is temple language. So this is addressed to the leadership, in particular the high priests, but also the priests, who are the ones that basically govern the temple institution. So in speaking of eating and drinking, etc., it's speaking of the food for the priests. Of course, when the animals were burned up, the food was given to the priests to eat. It's also talking about the libation offerings. So the eating and the drinking had to do with the priesthood in the temple, because this is a judgment on the institution of the temple, because it had been corrupted by the spiritual and condition of the high priests, and really not just the spiritual. And talking about taking wives or becoming wives, and this is indicating something to do with the double ritual of the betrothal and the full stage of marriage. And in my opinion, since we're dealing with the high priesthood, you must understand that the high priest could not enter into the Holy of Holies and make atonement unless he was married. This was critical. So if his wife died or something happened to his wife before he was to go in to serve the Holy of Holies, making atonement by the blood and the incense, he had to marry another wife. He had to be married in order to go into the Holy of Holies to make atonement for the people. And you can imagine what's going on with, you've basically got a criminal mafia running the temple, if you will. And because ones like Annas, the high priest, had handed down to, sons-in-law and family members, nothing whatever to do with the institution as it was designed back in the days of Moses and Aaron. So I believe this reference to the wives and taking wives had to do with the high priesthood as well. And so these are the signs that are being set up. Now this is a rather complex topic. Again, I don't have a lot of time, so I do have a whole teaching on this. I have various teachings on the temple, but in particular, the ark that Noah built is actually patterned after the temple, or vice versa. So the shape of the ark was rectangular. Now the measurements are not the same, but the basic shape of the ark was like the temple. There were 3 levels of sanctity inside the ark, just like there were in the temple itself. And so the top level which would have been the inner courtyard of the temple, was a place called the Beit HaMoked, the chamber of the hearth, which is where where the priests slept. And so this is where Noah and his family slept, if you will, in the third level in the inner courtyard area. It's interesting to me that if you take the word for the ark, teva, backwards it's habait, which means the house. Perhaps a coincidence, perhaps not. Also, the word is used 24 times in this particular Torah portion. And I find that to be quite significant, only because if you look at the design of the priesthood, they're designed into 24 courses, if you will. The Levites, the priests, and the men of Israel divided up in these 24 courses. You can find all this information in 1 Chronicles 24 through 28. But we have 24 guards in the temple, we have the 24 courses of the singers, and we have 24,000 for military service. So there is indeed a connection here, I think, between the 24 and the temple and Noah's Ark. I do believe that Noah's Ark was a picture and pattern of the temple. Again, the temple on top of the water, meaning the flood waters, as they receded and dry ground appeared, the temple would land, and it would bring stability and it would bring order to the entire world. Now we move into that particular passage, Matthew 24, 36 through 46, and it talks about two men in a field. One was taken, one left behind. Two women are grinding mill at the threshing floor, one taken, one left behind. Again, I believe personally this is temple language. If you go back and read the story of Noah, you will find that Noah was called a left behind one. The word that's used there is sha'ar, which means he was left behind or he remained. So God blotted out all that was on the face of the ground and on the face of the earth and heaven and earth, and he was the only one left behind, the only one, obviously with his family, total family of 8, but he was left surviving. He was left behind in the place of the protection and preservation of God, and that is inside the ark, of course, inside the temple, if you will. Now we have the two women grinding, so we have two men, we have two women, two remain, two are taken. So I believe the concept of the mill, it has to do with the threshing floor, which is one of the idioms for the temple. Of course, you know, David purchased the threshing floor from Arnon on the top of Mount Moriah, and that is the place of Mount Moriah, the place where the temple would be built. And of course, that's where the wheat was brought in to be separated, the wheat from the chaff, and the threshing would take place, and the winnowing, and all that sort of thing. The idea of the thief coming in the night, we see in the second temple, has to do with shepherds or leaders who led the sheep astray. So when it talks about the one who came to kill, steal, and destroy, it's not actually speaking in context of Satan, but rather the leadership of the temple. They're the ones that came to basically enslave the people and steal from them, is what's going on. So this is, I believe, an allusion to that just as well, that the leadership had become so corrupt that it was taking from the people. And the idea of staying faithful and loyal is basically covenant language. Anytime you have this idea of kindness and loyalty, it's speaking about the covenant. So there's a sense here of the breaking of that covenant, and that covenant needing to be restored, which we would see through Noach. Of course, he was given a sign of the eternal covenant, which was the bow in the skies, and it's not theoretically a rainbow, but the idea is that the bow would reach from heaven to earth and back again. And basically, in the ancient world, it was the connecting point, if you will, between heaven and earth. That was the purpose of the bow, and that is the purpose of the place of the temple, to be the connecting point between this world and the world to come. So we have this picture of Noah, a righteous one, a tamim, one who is complete and full, tzaddik hador, righteous in that generation, clearly pointing to Yeshua the Messiah, who was, as the temple, righteous in that generation. And so the ark was seen as a spiritual sanctuary as well as a physical sanctuary. And the idea for Noah to build this house, to preserve the seed, to take care of his family in order for the seed to continue, because that is the promise made by the creation covenant in the beginning for the land and for the seed. So basically, this passage we have in Matthew is a connecting point to Noah, all speaking of the temple, and all has allusions to that. And I can't stress enough how important it is to understand the context and to look at the spiritual condition of the second temple and the reason God judged it and brought the enemies and the flood, etc., in order to preserve those who were his. So, hope you've enjoyed this week's portion. See you next time. Shalom.